All right, so now for our next session. So again, we've got another great session. So again, we're still building off of some of the themes that were discussed in our panel. So now we're going to be taking a look at trans and non-binary perspectives on the gender narrative in engineering. So you already were introduced to Michelle. We also have here with us today, Allie. So I'll introduce Allie. So Allie Kennington is an environmental engineer in training at Atkins Realis. So this is formerly SNC Lavalin in Ottawa. So they specialize in hydrology, site assessment and remediation, and environmental regulation and compliance. Allie earned their BASc in geological engineering from the University of Waterloo and is currently pursuing a Master of Applied Science in civil engineering at the same institution. Their research focuses on enhancing the inclusion of diverse and marginalized users through the empathetic engineering design process. So welcome back, Michelle, and welcome, Allie.
Thank you all for being here. Welcome to our session titled, of course, as you've seen in the program, Trans and Non-Binary Perspectives, our perspectives on the gender narrative in engineering. I'm going to sort of shorten my intro here. You've heard, I think, enough about me and perhaps from me, but I'll continue speaking for a little bit nonetheless. I use they, them pronouns. I'm queer, non-binary, as you heard earlier, racialized, neurodivergent, and so on. I am a P.Eng in Ontario, and I'm getting licensed as a lawyer next week. So I'm really excited about that. And I think something that did come up in my intro earlier is that I'm also doing my PhD in engineering, entering the fourth year where I've been doing that research work in which I'm using different socio-legal frameworks like equality and human rights frameworks to really critically look at the engineering culture, so who's in the field, as well as the design processes, what the field outputs and what the products are that we create and how well they serve the public, of course. And so, given my sort of research focus and my identities, I like to generally say that I give these talks through, both a bit of that subject matter knowledge and my lived experience. Maybe I'll let Allie introduce themselves as well.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Allie Kennington. Thanks, Erin, for that fantastic introduction of me earlier. I'm a queer, non-binary engineer in training based out of the Ottawa area. I also have a chronic illness, and I'm a white settler to Canada. And I apologize if I sound a little froggish today. I got bronchitis last week for my birthday this year. Michelle and I were in Victoria at the CC West conference and went swimming at our hotel pool, which was a nice one, the Fairmont, but not only did they get an ear infection, so I'm on the right side because they can't really hear out of their left ear, but I got bronchitis and laryngitis. So we're battling these things. I might have to run away to cough. I promise neither of us are contagious, but I've got my hand sanitizer and lots of tissues here. And I'll leave it at that for myself, but I do want to highlight that Michelle and I also co-fund what we think is Canada's first scholarship for the 2S LGBTQ+ community in engineering at our alma mater, specifically at the University of Waterloo. And as Kim mentioned, 2S LGBTQ+ students may face compounding barriers due to their identities. And so engineering tuition is exceedingly expensive. We founded this scholarship back in 2020, and although it doesn't combat issues of meritocracy, we hope that it's a start. And so this fall, we will be supporting, I believe, our fourth recipient. Yeah. Oh, the fifth. And pictured here, the top in the middle is Arden Song, who's a fantastic management engineering graduate and now a master's student at the University of Waterloo, who received the scholarship last fall.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that. So just to let everyone know that this presentation, as all the ones that preceded, perhaps, will discuss the harms and violence that dominant groups perpetuate against equity-seeking and marginalized groups. And so the contents may trigger you, may feel harmful or violent, perhaps, to you. And so please feel free to take a breather outside. Or if you're watching online, please feel free to mute us, step away. And you can, of course, leave the session altogether. No offense taken on our part. But the overall sort of hope here is that you do what feels safe to you, that you do what you feel is necessary to feel safe and okay within this session and beyond. So just a sort of brief plan here for our 45 minutes together. And I know we're quite behind. And so if folks have to, leave to catch a flight or, attend to their, perhaps familial obligations. Again, no offense taken. Please get up and go. All good. And so the plan here is to do a land acknowledgement, and then we'll sort of identify our objective for the session. Then we'll launch into a bit of a contextual framework where we'll sort of discuss the key terms like, gender identity, expression. What do those really mean? And what do we mean by them when we use those terms? And then on that backdrop, we'll sort of get into some of the implications for engineering and in engineering. And then we'll talk a little bit about legal considerations and then wrap up with some practical tips and that further thinking piece if there's time. So just to give you an idea of what's on the docket, and we'll be tag teaming and going back and forth a little bit, so you don't have to hear hopefully too much from me all the time. I know you've heard from me already, so thank you for bearing with me here today. So just want to invite all the settlers here to join me in acknowledging, and I know we started the day with one, but just I guess we can sort of revisit that and renew that acknowledgement that Toronto is the traditional territory of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas, the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And for folks who are perhaps not familiar with land acknowledgements, or if you'd like me travel often across Canada or Turtle Island, native-land.ca, which you can access through the QR code here, is a really good resource. It's interactive, it's really accessible, and it is Indigenous led and operated, and it's a really good resource just for folks who want to learn more, including about the treaties that apply to where they are, for example, and just the overall history of that land from a sort of non-colonial lens. That's obviously really important. And if you've seen me present before, I always like to spend just a little bit more time situating land acknowledgements in engineering and technology, because people often, especially in our fields, our STEM fields, people often think that engineering is this objective and value-free discipline, right? And that truth and reconciliation are like sort of over there and we're over here. Although I was delighted to hear from Jeanette that, Engineers Canada is adding truth and reconciliation as one of its pillars of focus. So that's great. But so just overall, there still is this sentiment in engineering that, Indigenous issues or truth and reconciliation is kind of over there. It doesn't pertain to us. And so just to counter that sentiment a little bit, I want to just contextualize engineering's colonial history, right, as the building blocks of colonies, of slavery, racism, and more. Engineers, for example, built ships on which Europeans traveled to Turtle Island. Engineers designed, weapons and substances with which European settlers committed genocide against Indigenous peoples and continue to do so today. Engineers designed and built residential schools, as you see on the slide here. And so that list really goes on. It's on this page here is, a page out of the Engineering and Construction Design Package from Archives Canada of the Macintosh Day School. So residential school, but not sort of overnight, but the day schools. And this was one that was constructed in Sioux Lookout here in Northern Ontario that opened in 1925 and operated until 1969. And, we've heard, earlier a little bit about truth and reconciliation. So, the effects of residential and day schools, the abuse, torture, and murder of Indigenous children as have come up, obviously in the broader context. And so these violent acts all took place, at these very sites that engineers like us, I'm a civil engineer by training. So, my predecessors played a key part in the construction of these sites where these atrocious acts happened throughout history. And so our duty toward truth and reconciliation is quite significant and unmistakable. And I hope that we can all learn and do our work with that in mind as engineers. So sort of with that, the objective of the session is, to sort of not specifically focus on truth and reconciliation, but to really continue to explore these non-normative and historically marginalized perspectives. And today we want to chat specifically from our perspectives as members of the trans and non-binary community. And we want to sort of discuss some of the issues at the intersection of gender identity, expression, sexual orientation, and how those things might be live issues in engineering and to engineers.
And so when we say gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, what do we mean by these terms? This is a fantastic graphic that is from the Harvard School of Medicine, from some of their internal teachings to their staff members. But it shows kind of the relationship between sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and gender perception. So gender identity is a person's inner sense of being a man, a woman, another gender, or having no gender. Gender expression is how someone might outwardly communicate that gender. Gender perception, of course, then would be how that is being perceived by others around. And sexual orientation would then describe who one feels attraction towards. And gender and sexual orientation can both change over time. They can change day to day, within an hour, however you're feeling. And because Michelle and I often see women in engineering and female engineers being used interchangeably, we want to really stress that sex and gender are not the same thing. Sex is about biological attributes, and gender is a socially constructed role. They're related in the sense that people tend to impose someone's gender identity on them based on their sex or biological attributes, which can be and is often inappropriate and harmful. And so I'll use myself as an example here for why it doesn't make sense, or at least poses complexity. In a form or a survey, if I'm asked for my sex, I'm assigned female at birth. When I'm asked for my gender, I'm non-binary. These are different. And so this is something to be mindful of. So when you're trying to include people and how people might be excluded when you use sex and gender terminology interchangeably.
Yeah, it's just a bit of a pivot to some of the historical context on why, we talked a little bit about, why interchanging sex and gender terminology could be harmful, for example. So just want to sort of get into a bit of the historical backdrop of why some of these things can be triggering, harmful, and so on. And so just a little bit on homophobia here, which I think most of us know what that is. It's the fear, hatred, discomfort, mistrust of people who are queer or to us LGBTQ plus more generally. And our history in Canada is really, has been marked by many instances of persecution that is rooted in, of course, homophobia, dating as far back as 1648 was, I think the generally agreed upon beginning of persecution in the colonial context in Canada. So 1648, where the first was the first documented case of persecution based on sexual orientation that actually took place in Montreal, in my hometown. Montreal, so that's lovely. So I have a whole presentation on 2S LGBTQ plus history that I have a lot of content on, but I'll maybe just quickly highlight some examples that I often point out. And so in 1920, Canadian law first criminalized sodomy, which is of course anal sex between two men, as historically defined. And then that expanded over time to outlaw, to criminalize and label various queer acts under derogatory terms like psychopaths. So these are words that have appeared in legislation against LGBTQ plus people. Again, and this is starting in 1920. So not 100, not 200, 300. This is within the last 100 years. And then, in 1955, there was a trial of a woman in Yellowknife who was sentenced for 15 years for a minor affectionate gesture. I think the gesture was giving a fellow woman coworker, a peck on the cheek, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison for a homosexual act. There was also a 1974 custody case in Saskatchewan where a mother lost her custody of her child due to her lesbianism. Again, that was the word used in the court decision. And custody was given to the father, who was a known, abusive parent, unemployed, and so on. And that was still made him a more fit parent than the other queer parent. And so, and then systematic discrimination, of course, included the use of fruit machines. I don't know if folks are familiar with that term. It was a mechanism, right, used during the 1950s until the 1980s, arguably even the 90s, to identify and discharge queer individuals from the Canadian military and civil service. So it's often known as the Purge. If you look up the Purge on Google, you'll see there's a broad history on that. A lot of people were affected, and there was a settlement in the last decade around that event, that very harmful persecution perpetrated by the Canadian government in its military and civil services. And then other, larger scale police raids targeting queer communities, of course, like we know about the Toronto bathhouse raids that happened here in the city, starting in the 1970s, and, officially having ended in, the 80s, but really up till the 2000s, they were still happening, just police raids targeting LGBTQ spaces. And so the decriminalization of homosexual acts in 1969, of course, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, that sort of marked the beginning of that slow shift, right, toward more inclusive laws, including, the eventual recognition of same-sex marriage in 2005, which we have been able to benefit from. Of course, there are still issues like discrimination in the workplace that we've been talking about today, hate crimes within workplaces, on the streets and beyond. And, really ongoing debates, as I talked about a little bit earlier, about the rights of, for example, transgender individuals, youth, all of this sort of demonstrating that, the fight is really far from over in this story. And then similarly, transphobia, and then I'll talk about transmisia, the other word on the slide here in a sec. And so transphobia is when, folks have deeply rooted negative beliefs, right? So same thing with homophobia. It's deeply rooted negative beliefs about what it means to be trans, non-binary, gender nonconforming. So just like homophobia, these beliefs, affect the ways that individuals, the government, the organizations, the media, and society generally treat people whose identities don't fit into, those typical binary gender roles. And so you might be wondering what the transmisia piece is about. And so, well, phobia, as we all know, means to be fearful of something, which, really isn't an accurate way to talk about oppression, because phobia in the medical sense, right, is an anxiety disorder. And so saying transphobia sounds like an individual medical condition, and that really downplays the systemic and institutional, harm that are perpetrated against trans and non-binary people. And so transphobia is increasingly referred to as transmisia. And so the misia suffix means hatred. So this is a helpful word to, better and more accurately identify this phenomenon, because it highlights the prejudice, right, at the root of these beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, and systems that hurt and deny often the existence of trans and non-binary people. So just some quick examples here, laws, as I talked about earlier, laws restricting access to restrooms, healthcare, sports, and so on, that have popped up in New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Quebec, Ontario, that really restricts access to these things that are, in a way that aligns with one's gender identity, prevalent stereotypes in media, harmful and interpersonal actions like dead naming, misgendering, which is using the name of somebody before transition. That's dead naming, and misgendering. If I tell you my pronouns are they, them, and you continue to use she, her, for me, that's misgendering. And so transmissive beliefs, of course, stem from stereotypes, learned just like any other form of hate, right? It's learned, often at home, school, through social media, other forms of media. And that really contributes to, the widespread, but also often unnoticed or undernoticed discrimination against trans and non-binary individuals. And of course, that can lead to, significant social and personal consequences, including we were talking about, workplace, advancing in your career, for example. So in that context, it could also lead to housing discrimination, landlords not wanting to rent to, trans, deviant folks, or that sort of, prejudice against trans folks. And that happens, here in Canada, where we have human rights protection. Nonetheless, these things happen. And so here I just have a couple photos here from just last year, very transmissive signs from some of the protests that I was talking about earlier that took place in the fall, that say things like, being trans or non-binary is like some gender ideology agenda. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm happy to assure folks that, as a member of the trans community, my identity is not an agenda. I'm just here. I just am, like you and you and you. I'm just here.
Yeah, I would echo that. I am also just here. And so in the context of women's spaces, I wanted to highlight that some women might perpetuate transmisia. These are typically trans exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs. And TERFs are a faction within feminism that reject the inclusion of transgender and non-binary individuals, particularly transgender women, from women's spaces. TERFs deny the identities of transgender people and advocate typically for policies that will exclude them. And so TERFs often spread misinformation and contribute to hostile environments for transgender and non-binary people. Exclusion might manifest by opposing transgender people's access to gender-affirming healthcare, like through these bills that Michelle has mentioned in New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and beyond, or in the UK. by opposing access to legal recognition, or even safe spaces like access to washrooms, which is quite common as well in the UK and in the US. TERF's beliefs are based on the notion that by supporting trans rights, women's rights will be weakened. And in 2016, the Canadian Bar Association assessed that by supporting trans rights, they would not infringe on any rights that exist for women. It's not really how our legal structure works in Canada. Rights are not a competition after all. And so the influence of TERFs can impact public opinion and policy. Pictured at the top left, of course, is J.K. Rowling, a well-documented TERF. I think there's a bigger story there that's a bit more applicable to another presentation. But I wanted to highlight that privilege and platform can be used to further these hateful beliefs. And so in particular, TERF groups in Canada actively petitioned against Bill C-16 back in 2016, which was passed in 2016 to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination. And so these concepts lead us to intersectionality, which is one of the ways that we just discussed interact in real life. And so, like the fact that people experience a combination of barriers depending on many elements of their identities, sexuality, race, gender identity, ability, and age, I'm going to use my identities to illustrate. 2S LGBTQ plus affinity spaces are often very white. And so I've had privilege to go there and be accepted as a member of those communities. But I'm often seen as a very masculine person. And so in, just like Michelle mentioned, washrooms earlier today, I often find it difficult to use gendered washrooms. In women's washrooms, when I'm looking dressed very masculine, I've had women come into the washroom and be very, very aghast and usually not say anything to me, but just think that they've entered a space that is not meant for them. Where on the other side, I'm feeling like I'm in a space that's not meant for me. So often I say, hey, no, it's okay. This is a women's washroom. I'm just heading out. And then on the other side, I typically feel comfortable using the men's washroom. Thankfully, they're quite clean in this room, but or in this building, I should say, but often they're not so clean. And so I'm often stuck between a rock and a hard place with my identity. And please go ahead.
And the other example that we had here, just in our notes here, was just when I tried joining NG Queers in my first year of undergrad at Waterloo, and this was when NG Queers coming out of MAC, first started in the early 2010s, and so it was new. And I tried to go to this meeting. It was a meet and greet, and I got to the door, at Waterloo in the Poets area. For those who know, there was a door that said, a door with a sign that said NG Queers, and NG Queers is the sort of national 2S LGBTQ plus and sharing, advocacy group, and they have chapters at every school for those who are not familiar with NG Queers. So I arrive at this door, there's a sign that says NG Queers meet and greet. And so I opened the door and there were 4 or 5 people sitting there, all white. And they kind of just stared at me in silence. And then finally one of them said, "Oh, this is NG Queers. Like, what are you looking for?" So to Allie's point about, being white and being very accepted in queer spaces, when you're not white, that sort of level of acceptance can really decrease as your privileged identities, as you have fewer privileged identities. And so that was just one of the examples we wanted to use to illustrate intersectionality as well.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And so just like Michelle was mentioning, where we might fit in for one identity, we might be excluded for another. And the point here isn't to say that it can be hard for people to feel inclusion and belonging when affinity efforts often operate in isolation in the absence of intersectional considerations.
Yeah. Okay, I feel like I'm speaking sort of very quickly, so I'm just going to take a breather. Everyone doing okay? We're following, we're good. I know we're speaking sort of fairly quickly here, but hopefully we'll have time for a bit of a, interactive engagement at the end there. And so unlike Alvin earlier, who started by saying that he's not going to just stand up here and talk for 45 minutes, we will, as if you haven't noticed. So that's what's going on. So thank you for your patience. So we know, of course, that the engineering discipline is playing catch up to other traditionally, men-dominated professions in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and all of these other sort of, metrics. And And, we've heard lots about how that's the case for numbers around women specifically, and historically data collected on female engineers and women and so on. And as we've heard again from Jeanette, from Kim, there's this, increasing, recognition that we need to expand our discussion of gender specifically to not just address, the underrepresentation of women, but to address the experiences of engineers of all underrepresented genders, including trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming engineers. And that's why Jeanette kept saying earlier, it's not just about, kept saying men, women, binary. It's because there is a whole other spectrum of genders, of course, outside of the binary. And so this community, as you can sort of, hopefully imagine based on the preceding slides on the historical context, we also face, like women, we also face elevated challenges and discrimination, and nowadays often exacerbated by this rising anti-2S LGBTQ plus sentiments in Canada. And so just some numbers here, speaking of engineers liking numbers. And so according to the 2021 census, 1 in every 125 people born between 1997 and 2006 identified as trans and non-binary, and 1 in every 200 people born between 1981 and 1996, so a little bit before that, also identified as trans and non-binary. And then specifically to engineering, and not very many institutions or faculties of engineering collect this data right now. As Jeanette was saying earlier, there historically has been, male, female, and then, prefer not to disclose, which doesn't really tell us a whole lot. But now U of T is one of the sort of leading schools collecting this data. They collected not just, choose not to report, but also another gender aside from men or women, which is a little bit, not perfect, but a little bit more specific. And the data that they got was that 1 in every 30. So that's pretty significant. 1 in every 30 people in the incoming U of T class in 2022, so 2 years ago, reported another gender aside from man or woman. And so one of the issues, of course, is this lack of, better and more comprehensive data collection process and analysis on gender identity by engineering regulators, as we were hearing about, by schools, by workplaces. And, that's, I think, one of the critical issues here. And it's funny, we're often told that there aren't enough of us to collect data on us. And, when there's 1 or 2 data points, they're considered outliers, right? So when we analyze data purely quantitatively, they're outliers and they're thrown out. But then I'm told that no policy decisions can account for trans engineers, for example, because we don't have data, right? So it's this like circular problem of when there is a little bit of data, it's thrown out because it's insignificant, it's an outlier, but then we're told that, oh, there's no data. It's like, well, so this is really rooted, I think, in this lack of recognition that, trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people are in engineering. We're here. And so please collect data about us.
Michelle used a key word there that I want to highlight in getting into our next topic on impact assessments, is recognition. And for those of us in the room who might be in civil or environmental engineering or work in similar consulting or construction fields, or those who aren't in those fields, impact assessments are typically and usually legally required for planning and decision-making purposes to evaluate the purpose of a project. These impact assessments will evaluate environmental, cultural, economic, health, and social effects of a proposed project, as well as impacts to Indigenous groups and Indigenous rights. And so some folks in the room, like I said, who work in these industries, civil engineering, environmental engineering, or construction, might be familiar with these and might even have worked on them in the past, typically usually just using an impact assessment to inform their work. Usually these impact assessments are reviewed and undertaken by a whole team of planning professionals or environmental professionals, but they'll be reviewed and undertaken and considered heavily by professional engineers through the proposal stage and through the actual project. And so one key example of an impact assessment that came up quite recently here in Toronto had to do with Hanlan's Point. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, Hanlan's Point is part of the Toronto Islands, is among Canada's oldest surviving queer spaces. It was designated as a 2S LGBTQ plus landmark and safe space for 2S LGBTQ plus folks for at least 80 years, and has served as the site of Toronto's very first Pride event on August 1st, 1971. And I think Toronto Pride just kicked off yesterday, so the events are coming up for those of you who might be interested. I think the parade's on the weekend of the 28th. Just a little tip. So this sounds like an important cultural heritage site, right? You would think so. But just last year, in 2023, there was a proposal to build a permanent concert and festival space similar to Ontario Place or Exhibition Place at Hanlan's Point. And the proposal contained an environmental impact assessment report, which included a cultural component. That cultural component said nothing about the significance of Hanlan's Point for Canada's 2S LGBTQ+ culture and history. So had Michelle or I been one of those engineers who was reviewing the reports or been a part of the planning process of preparing that report, we might have been a little bit more likely to know about Hanlan Point's history. And we might have stood up and, said, I think we might have missed something in the cultural impact report or cultural impact assessment. Maybe we need to reconsider the placement of this project. And of course, the ways in which we entrench our own perspectives and biases can be much more complex in terms of the ways engineering design processes play out. But this section is just to show what is meritorious, or what is just a meritorious proposal can look so different depending on who's carrying out the practice and who's reviewing it. So we have a few other examples that Michelle and I like to mention. I'll go through them quickly and then you can jump in if there's anything I've missed. And there's dozens of examples coast to coast that Michelle and I are familiar with from a civil and environmental engineering perspective. There's Hogan's Alley in the city of Vancouver, which was a predominantly Black neighborhood located just south of Chinatown, that in the 60s was destroyed to build a viaduct through the city. Just an elevated expressway. There's the Pine Hill Cemetery on Conestoga in Mohawk Land near Montreal. There's Vancouver Chinatown, just north of Hogan's Alley, of course. And Africville in Halifax, a story that I hope most people in this room would be familiar with. And all of these sites have had decisions made about them based on proposals that were supposed to be meritorious, based on criteria that were set by people who were not a part of these communities and who likely did nothing to try to learn about these communities. Often the proposals had the sole aim of turning profits or making space for white settlers. Anything to add here?
No, I think just really good examples to illustrate, the fact that impact assessments, as much as they are touted as this tool, that prevents us from, carrying out inequitable practices. It's supposed to be the safeguard, right, that helps us make good decisions. Just again, some examples where that was obviously not the case, at least for the people who were, living in these communities and who were not consulted or considered adequately. So a little bit about the law here again. And I talked about one of these already just down on the panels. Maybe I'll just kind of skip over that one here. But just want to kind of zoom in on, on the question of, well, so what are some of the potential legal considerations for engineers in this inclusion, equity conversation? And so I'm just going to focus again on Ontario. That's usually the case study that I have in my work. And so the three sort of, obligations or responsibilities, if you want to call them, would be the professional, ethical, and human rights obligations. And so the professional one I spoke to earlier arises from, the regulating or governing statute in Ontario. That's the Professional Engineers Act. And then the ethical obligations in Ontario, not the case in all the provinces, but in Ontario, that's Section 7 of the Act. So the ethical obligations are a part of that Professional Engineers Act as well. And then, of course, other statutes like human rights codes, privacy codes, different other legislation that may constrain, right, or dictate what engineers can or cannot do. So the professional obligation, or that legal obligation, this is the one I was talking about earlier, the public interest mandate. I'll just sort of, I think, not repeat too much here, but this is the act that I was talking about, and there's the language, of course, of the public interest mandate, and I bolded it there, where it says, that there's that public interest mandate in Section 2.3. And then there's also, which is not on here, but there's also the Professional Engineering Practice Guide that PEO put out based on, as an interpretation of their governing statute that says that engineering is a profession where the primary responsibility is to the third party. So not your employer, not your client, but the public, right? So lots of different language that reinforces this obligation, some, of course, directly in the legislation itself, and some in some of these interpretive documents. And I won't repeat the Supreme Court story. You've heard it just now. So of course, just overall sort of, I think, an advocacy point here for regulators to consider moving toward that interpretation, right, of equal access, diversity, and preventing harm to differently identified communities within engineering. So the other sort of piece here is the ethical obligations. And so, I think there's this obligation arising from both normative, right, discourse on engineering ethics. And I think we all take the law and ethics course in our undergrad CEAB curriculum. And so there's, of course, the law piece on contracts and torts, but then the piece on ethics. And so, topics on politics, sociology of technology, philosophy, and the impact of values, for example, on technological design. Or if you've taken like a society, technology, and values course, you'll have talked about lots of these ethical principles. And then there's sort of this understanding that we may conceivably be failing, right, to meet these ethical obligations when we view our work as, neutral and objective. Of course, despite our work and the engineering problems that we solve, having the tendency to have numerous solutions, right? So when we look at an engineering problem, there's rarely one solution. That's just not what it is. And so, and these problems often, require us to select or recommend, the solution that we perceive to be the best. And so, so with that, the work of an engineer tends to have two dimensions, right? The understanding of scientific and mathematical principles, and that's perhaps the more objective and value neutral dimension. For example, we know that 1 + 1 is 2, and we compute, those equations. And that's not usually a concept that's up for debate between two differently identified or situated engineers. That's sort of the more objective piece. But then there's the piece around exercising judgment, right, as to which, for example, scientific or mathematical principles or models to apply. What constraints are you going to impose on, on the application of that principle or model? What criteria are you going to use in selecting the solution to recommend to your client, for example, among other processes? And so those are the more subjective dimensions, right? And that's the dimension that can be really sensitive, of course, to our values and perspectives. And that's sort of, the dimension that I think ethical frameworks can sort of play an important role. And that value sensitive dimension, includes, of course, again, those trade-offs and things like, cost. And so, which communities are allocated more resources to have this infrastructure built for them? Where are we putting these infrastructure? Where, if we think about where dams or, waste management facilities, where are those placed? Are they placed, near white upper middle class neighborhoods? Typically not, right? And so the last one that I'll chat about here is the human rights piece. And so there's, obligations around human rights, of course, to promote and uphold equity inclusion principles. Those are often seen as mechanisms, right, toward meeting human rights obligations, and that arise from provincial and federal human rights legislation. So in Ontario, we have the Human Rights Code pictured here. And so it enumerates, there's two things that the code does that I want to highlight here. The first thing is that it enumerates protected grounds, right? So you might have heard this terminology before. So it's just, what we often call identities, or I think it was referred to as, dimensions, equity dimensions earlier. But the protected grounds enumerated in the code are citizenship, race, place of origin, ethnic origin, color, ancestry, disability, age, creed, sex, pregnancy, family status, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, which are new, receipt of public assistance, and record of offenses. And so these are the protected grounds, right, on which the second thing that the code does is, on these grounds, the code prohibits professional practitioners, like engineers, from discriminating based on these grounds in the way that we provide services, in the preparation of a contract, and in our employment decisions. And so, the code, again, makes clear that failure to address these, formal or substantive inequality constitutes discrimination. That's where that language comes from within the legal context. And so, in other words, we could conceivably understand that providing engineering services toward, a design, for example, that better serves some groups, or, placing a waste management facility near where you're, away from where your friends live and closer to, Indigenous or Black or racialized communities, for example, that could be considered, right? That service, the way that you provide that service and design, that could be considered discriminatory under the Human Rights Code. And so this means that, right, engineers' human rights obligations include, for example, the need to ensure that all members of the public experience an environment free of barriers. So for civil engineers, that's often something that we actually ironically don't think about, but the accessibility piece of our buildings. And so engineers who fail to apply, this sort of, whether it's universal design or something else, they could actively be creating barriers between, the public and accessing, education, healthcare, transportation, and so on. And so thereby just meaning that the way that they provide this engineering service could be in violation of the Human Rights Code. So that's the other thing, the third thing to be sort of considerative in the legal context. And then I know we've got, I think, 8 minutes left. So maybe we'll move into some practical tips here that I'll let Allie chat about.
Yeah, of course. And I think one of the biggest questions that I heard asked earlier is what can we do if we are dealing with discrimination? Or, what happens if the response to that discrimination, that response to speaking up isn't exactly what we expected? And people of all ages who experience discrimination often feel afraid to tell anyone what's happening. And I want to approach this from my very privileged perspective, as a white settler. Despite my privilege, I've not found great success in reporting workplace discrimination to HR or upper management. And so I want to highlight other support mechanisms outside of your place of work. You might find support from people who share your equity-seeking identities or identity. You might find support through local or community organizations, from people you trust, ranging from friends to therapists, or legal resources that can help you understand your rights and help you file applications or claims against discriminatory acts. There's a fantastic link there that has mental health support from the Government of Canada, and another resource that Michelle and I haven't shared here, but is quite important, is one called justicetrans.org. It's a pretty comprehensive legal resource for trans rights in Canada. And so if you or someone you know is thinking about suicide or in need of mental health support, it's very important that you call or text 988, which is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'll share on behalf of Michelle that they lost a racialized transgender friend in engineering to suicide because of the discrimination they faced. So we're very serious.
Engineering, specifically in their engineering education and workplace.
Yeah, that's right. And so we're completely serious when we say don't wait until it's too late. And I'm thankful that we got to follow Alvin's presentation, so that all of us in this room got to take in his fantastic presentation on allyship. And we've got a slew of tips there, and Alvin did, of course, as well. But I think I want to echo what he said about just being humble and being open to humility. Take a chance and stand up for folks around you. Be an ally and make an attempt and listen for feedback if you need to improve. And don't take it personally. It's an opportunity to learn and an opportunity to grow, not only for yourself, but for your community. Take the chance, of course, as well, to educate yourself and question your own assumptions. I know we're running out of time here, so I'm kind of sped through the individual actions, but with respect to organizational inclusion, I think that one of the biggest things that I find most relevant to engineering workplaces is how management and senior management, or even just intermediate colleagues, show up to me as an intermediate junior employee myself. Don't perpetuate the idea that emotions have no place in the workplace. Don't give backhanded compliments or say things like you're being overly sensitive, or hey, this is just how things work around here. This is what you can expect on the construction site. And it's very important not to minimize anybody's experience or allow the experience of privileged voices to dominate or become the focus. It can be hard, especially as engineers who are very solution oriented, to not focus on solutions. We want to be solution oriented and look at exactly how we can solve the problem. But I don't think this group of 40 or so folks in this room, it'd be great if we'd be able to solve racism and homophobia today, but unfortunately, I don't know if it's within our wheelhouse. And so instead, it's important to state our commitments and be realistic about what we're able to do to be sustainable in developing personable solutions for each other. And just in wrapping up, I'll pass it to Michelle for the final bit.
Yeah, I'll actually just go back to 2 points here on the ally slide that I think is important to flag for, especially in in seeking to be allies to trans and non-binary people. And I think one of them is, these, I refer to them as backhanded compliments, like, when this is, happens often with trans folks, like, oh, I wouldn't have guessed that you were trans, or, oh, but you look like a real girl. Like, these are, I mean, we laugh, but these are things I've heard that people were, well-intentioned and giving as compliments. And so these are, this big no-no, I think, I hope. And the other one that I wanted to flag is, if you don't know a person's pronouns, or, if they've, if you're not sure if about dead naming them, ask them about their name and pronouns. And if you're not sure about how to pronounce their name, again, ask them. And, this goes for everybody, not just people that you think look trans or look a certain way. And once they tell you their pronouns and their name, please remember it. Don't make it a habit to bother them 7 times about, their pronouns, their name. Remember it and use it correctly and consistently. I think that's quite key, because the burden to have to keep correcting folks, right, is quite can be quite heavy. Just wanted to flag those 2 specific tips.
Thank you.
And so just to wrap up here, this is a slide I always use. It's a quote from Engineers Canada that says that EDI work, is and has always been challenging because it invites us to, or self-reflect as individuals and as organizations. It requires, and this is the most important part, I think, of the quote, it requires the exploration and acknowledgement of inequities and overcoming the defensiveness, right? There's often that piece. It's like people get up in arms and defensive when they hear EDI, and then they're worried about reverse discrimination. There's all these defensiveness that comes up in conversations on power and privilege. And so, and the other quote I really like that I think is also a good prompt for that self-reflection that we just talked about, that Deanna Burgard, I don't know if folks know Deanna, Indigenous engineer out of Alberta, excellent ally mentor. It says that when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. So again, if any part of what we said perhaps made you uncomfortable or frustrated or defensive, there's, I think, the invitation to take time to reflect on your power and privilege, and how you impact those around you, as well as how your work as an engineer or engineering, quasi-engineering professional, impact those your users and the public. So just a couple resources here from the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. So speaking of learning more, the QR codes will take you to a long list of videos, webinars, books, reports, movies, shows, songs, podcasts, art. Really, it's truly quite comprehensive in terms of the type of materials on each topic. And so 2S LGBTQ+ broadly, and then creating a transgender inclusive workplace. Those are 2 really good resources. I really can't overstate how good they are for folks who want to learn more, for policymakers and organizations. So just QR codes here, and I'm happy to share the slides for folks who don't catch it right now. And I know we're over time, so I maybe won't dwell on these too much, but the first call to action that we wanted to leave you with was to be skeptical of supposedly good or neutral engineering designs, processes, and elements of the culture, especially if someone goes, oh, well, but this is how it's always been done. To me, that's always a red flag. That's when you should sort of start putting on your critical lens to be like, well, says who and who has it served historically. The second one here is, I think we talked about this, be an ally, speak up against hate, no matter how minor or subtle. And I talked about this earlier, rights erode very quickly when people are complacent, and, rights are eroding quickly before our eyes in our country, in the US. And so just to please not be complacent, and to please speak up in protection of our rights. So thanks very much. Welcome any thoughts or feedback via this QR code. We'd love to receive them. And we are partners. And so if you if you thought I was horrible and you want to send a feedback to Allie about me, just know that Allie will tell me, and vice versa. And so there's no wall or confidentiality between us. So at your own risk, of course. So email, LinkedIn, or X. And if your organization is ever looking for folks who can speak from subject matter knowledge and that lived experience on these topics, human rights, equality, diversity, and so on. I do work as a speaker and a consultant, so please connect, and I'd be happy to chat more about how we can collaborate. Thank you.